How do you define greatness? Who's great? Is the most valuable player of the Super Bowl great? How about the songwriter with the most #1 hits of all time? How about the movie star who gets the most money per film? I can't believe he gets $40 million per film. How about some world leader? Who's great and who is the greatest? Back in Jesus' day, it was a Roman emperor. He was considered the greatest person in the entire empire, which extended from Europe down to northern Africa and over to Asia. It was huge. The next greatest, just below the emperor, were the senators, the lawmakers. Below them were the equestrians, people who could prove that they had a certain level of wealth. The emperor, the senators, the equestrians, they made up 2% of the entire population. They were the top 3 rungs on the ladder. And they were very conscious of that. They were very class conscious and always looking for ways to move up, to elevate themselves, to become more important, to become greater. Becoming greater was the primary focus of many of their lives, because the higher they climbed, the more people they could look down on. They got a certain amount of pleasure out of that, being able to look down on people. The commoners, which made up the other 98% of the population, were also very class conscious. And they were divided into some very distinct groups. The highest ranking commoners were the freeborn Roman citizens. Below them were freeborn people who lived throughout, freeborn residents of Italy. Next were freeborn foreigners. Then came former slaves who'd been freed. And then at the very bottom, the lowest rung on the ladder, were the people who were slaves. This class consciousness in the Roman Empire was a very visible thing. It showed in the way people worked so hard to elevate themselves. It showed in the way people acted toward others, kind of looking down their noses at them. It showed in the way people boasted to build themselves up, in the way they strutted when they walked around through the marketplace. It even showed in their clothing. Can you imagine that? People were conscious of their clothing? Who'd have thought? Yeah, people still are. A lot of us are conscious of our clothing. We wear whatever brand is in. Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Michael Kors, Prada. Did I say that one right? Tommy Hilfiger, I know that one. And Nike. Do you know Nike is the #1 selling brand in the world? I didn't know that till this week, but it is. And what about Cinch, Wrangler, Carhartt, or Ariat for Western wear? People want their clothing to make a statement about them. I'm in style. I'm important. I'm wealthy. I'm country. Our clothing often makes a statement, just as it did back in ancient Rome. But there was something different about back in ancient Rome. People didn't wear their clothing based on their taste. They wore their clothing based strictly on their class. There wasn't any choice. People from the emperor on down wore clothing that indicated where they were on this ladder. They had to wear the clothing that pertained to their class. It was like military rank. To wear the wrong rank or to wear the rank of someone above you was a serious offense. So only the emperor wore the emperor's clothes. Only senators wore togas with purple stripes on them. Only equestrians wore golden rings. Each class had its own distinct clothing, so anyone could determine how important somebody else was just by looking at what they had on their backs. Jesus lived in that world, but he wasn't caught up in things like that, things that separated people. He didn't play the game of power and money and influence. He gave respect to those to whom respect was due, but he also gave respect to everybody. Life for Jesus was about love. Love for God and love for people. Not a few people, all people. He wasn't the least bit interested in elevating himself or putting others down. Jesus' goal was to bring people together. He wanted to lift everyone up. He lived and he died so we could rise to new life. In Jesus' day, most Roman citizens refused to do manual labor. They thought working with their hands was beneath them. Isn't it interesting that before Jesus became a teacher, he was a carpenter, he worked with his hands. And unlike most people, Jesus chose to spend time with people others might have considered beneath him. He went to the lowly, to the downcast. He spent time with the outcasts. He sought them out. He went to the sick and the crippled and the needy. He made time for foreigners, women and children, widows and orphans. Even when he was with powerful people at dinners, in their homes, in the synagogue, Jesus paid close attention to the needy. That's where his focus was. He wasn't the least bit concerned with trying to impress anyone. Never sought worldly position or power. There's no doubt he could have, right? As God's Son with all the creative power of the universe at his fingertips, he could have done whatever he wanted. But he didn't exploit his relationship with the Father. Instead, Jesus used everything he had to reach out with humility and grace to serve the needs of others. One day, Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, with him. They were hiking up the mountain. He took them all the way up to the top of a high mountain. When they arrived, something strange happened. Jesus' clothes turned white, blazing bright. They almost couldn't look at him. His appearance changed completely right before his eyes. They called this the transfiguration. As the 3 disciples stood there in awe, Moses and Elijah showed up, and they began a conversation with Jesus. The next thing they knew, a dark cloud covered them, and a deep, booming voice spoke from the cloud. "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." And then just as quickly as it started, it was over. The voice, the cloud, Moses and Elijah, everything was gone. It was just Peter, James, John, and Jesus. Those 3 disciples learned something about Jesus up on the mountain that day. They found out their teacher was more than a compassionate, loving teacher. A nice human being who was kind to others, looking out for their needs. Someone who was committed to God. They found out Jesus was God's own Son. And they heard it from God's own lips. No one else on earth could make that claim. No one else in heaven could make that claim. No one was greater or more powerful. But Jesus ordered them not to tell a soul, at least not yet, not until after his death. Sometime later, 2 of those 3 disciples, James and John, remembering what they'd seen and heard on the mountain that day, they asked Jesus a question. They asked if they could sit at his right and left hand in glory, if they could be his right and left hand men, if they could have the positions, the most powerful positions in his kingdom, of course, next to Jesus' position. They wanted the most powerful positions. When they asked Jesus about that, Jesus not only said no, he said, "Heavens, no." Well, he actually told them they didn't know what they were talking about. They were clueless. A little later, when the other 10 disciples found out about it, they got angry with James and John. They didn't like that at all. And it became clear to Jesus that he needed to sit down all 12 of his disciples to have a discussion with them about greatness. And this is where our Bible reading picks the story up. I'll be reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 41 through 45. I invite you to stand as you're able. Mark chapter 10, 41 through 45. Now, when the other 10 disciples heard about this, they became angry with James and John. Jesus called them over and said, you know that the ones who are considered the rulers by the Gentiles show off their authority over them, and their high-ranking officials order them around. But that's not the way it will be with you. Whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you will be the slave of all. For the human one didn't come to be served, but rather to serve and to give his life to liberate many people. This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. Whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you will be slave of all. I can see the disciples scratching their heads wondering, what? Where did this come from? Because they, like everyone else, were very conscious of class, position, power, and greatness. But what Jesus just told them turned their idea about greatness, turned the world's idea about greatness upside down completely. To be great, to be first, a person had to become a slave. A person had to become last. Jesus knew his disciples weren't able to understand this. The idea of becoming a slave went against everything they'd ever learned or experienced. Besides, if they took it seriously, it was a tough lesson to swallow. It would be a tough thing to live out. So one of the last things Jesus did for his disciples was provide them an example. He demonstrated what he meant. The evening he ate his final meal with his disciples, Jesus got up from the dinner table. He took his robe off, put a towel around his waist. Then he poured some water in a bowl. Then he got down on his knees and began to wash his disciples' feet. First one, then another. Jesus made his way around the table from the feet of one disciple to the next. And they were shocked. They didn't know what to say or do. Peter attempted, as he always did, put his foot in his mouth. They just didn't understand. So when Jesus finished, he put his robes back on. He returned to his place at the table. And he asked, do you know what I just did for you? I'm pretty sure most of them were shaking their heads. No, we don't get it. So Jesus spelled it out. You call me teacher and Lord. And you're right. That is who I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you need to wash each other's feet. I've given you an example. You need to do what I just did. Just as Jesus willingly served them, they needed to willingly serve each other. Just as Jesus humbly took the position of a slave, demonstrating his true greatness, they needed to take the position of a slave. If they truly wanted to follow Jesus, if they truly wanted to live for him, that's what they needed to do. It was the only way. In a world in which most people were doing whatever it took to rise above others, lying, cheating, backstabbing, stealing. In a world in which so many people lived to get to the top, Jesus told his followers they needed to work their way down to the bottom, the very bottom rung. Several hours after washing his disciples' feet, Jesus was arrested. He was taken in. He was interrogated. He was beaten and whipped, finally let out of the town. and crucified, put to death. Roman citizens were usually put to death through beheading or being burned alive. But Jesus was executed in a way that was typically reserved for slaves. He was hung on a cross. He was crucified like the lowest of the low. So it's quite interesting and surprising. It's actually miraculous, the way things worked out after Jesus' death. Within a few decades, his followers began writing poetry, writing songs about him that were inspired by his life. Centuries later, people were still at it. Composers like Bach and Handel produced some of the best music the world has ever known. And they did it in Jesus' name. In every era since Jesus' life, people have been inspired to write music about him. Think of all the hymns in all of the different languages and all the different hymnals. Think about all the music, the gospel and contemporary Christian music on the radio today. Jesus inspired it all. He's inspired more music than anyone else ever has. More than anyone. And guess what? He's still inspiring it. In the world of art, Jesus inspired the most massive outpouring of creativity the world has ever known. You may have seen this on some billboards around town. No one else is even close. All of the paintings, all the stained glass, all the sculptures. Jesus, listen to this, Jesus is the most recognizable figure in the entire world, even though no one knew what he looked like. No one knows what he looked like, but he is the most recognizable person in the world. Talk about irony. It's amazing. And what about the world of architecture? Over the last 2,000 years, that's St. Paul's Cathedral, Christianity has been the single greatest factor in the development of architecture. Hundreds of thousands of cathedrals, basilicas, churches, chapels, and missions have been built. And all of these buildings have come into existence because of the influence of one man. On top of all that, there's been a tremendous amount of writing inspired by Jesus. More books and articles have been written about him than anyone else in the history of the world. It kind of makes me wonder, what would the world have been like? What would the world be like if Jesus had never come into it? If you lived back in Jesus' day, if you were alive the day after his death, you could have seen the immense, magnificent, dominant Roman Empire with its 250,000 miles of highways. You could have seen its social status that was the envy of the world. You could have seen the Roman emperor at the seat of power in the city of Rome. And across the Mediterranean in Jerusalem, you could have seen a handful of frightened, defeated, demoralized, confused followers of Jesus. And if someone asked you which group would still be around 2,000 years later, I do believe you would have said the people in the Roman Empire. If someone asked you who history would remember more, a lowly manual labor born in a stable in Bethlehem, or the emperor of Rome? I'm guessing you would have said the emperor. Anybody know the name of the emperor when Jesus was alive? We all know Jesus' name. Do you know the name of the emperor when Jesus was alive? Tiberius was the emperor of Rome. So, see, 400 years after Jesus' death, the Roman Empire was completely gone. While Christianity and its founder, Jesus, Christianity was growing like wildfire. Knowledge about Jesus was growing like wildfire. Over the last 20 centuries, many people have become faithful followers of Jesus. And just as his powerful teachings and example have changed their lives, they've brought change to the world. And in the process, they've helped redefine greatness. True greatness is attained by people who humbly serve the needs of others. True greatness is attained by people who surrender their desire for worldly fame and fortune, their desire for worldly prestige, to work their way down to the bottom rung. Jesus surrendered his position and power when he left heaven to come down to our level here on earth. He dropped beneath us to serve like a slave and died like the lowest of the low. There's never been and there never will be a more powerful demonstration of true greatness. That's why Jesus was and is and always will be the greatest of all. Amen.